Okay, so let's turn in our Bibles to Isaiah. Chapter 13 is where we're going to be today. We've looked at chapters 1 to 5, which is the prelude. Everything in 1 to 5 is giving us a kind of an introduction to everything that's in the rest of the book. That's why it's an important section to know. And then chapters 6 to 12 are the first part of the second section, which is all about the child. So today we're going to start at chapter 13 and go to chapter 18. That's my plan. So chapters 13 to 18, they belong to a larger section, which is 13 to 25. And 13 to 25 describes the wrath of God on the nations. There are 14 oracles contained in these chapters against the nations. And an oracle, again, is an oracle of judgment. It's a prophetic announcement of what the wrath of God will look like when it comes. That's what it is. It's the prophetic announcement of what the wrath of God will look like when it comes. So God's wrath is going to come on all of these nations. And the picture that Isaiah is describing for us is describing what the wrath of God looks like for these nations. So they're prophetic announcements. They're proclamations of what the future will look like. And again, in our scripture reading from Matthew 23 and 24, Jesus pronounced an oracle of judgment, an oracle about what the wrath of God will look like for Jerusalem particularly, and on the temple. And Jesus was announcing that the last day for the Jews was coming to this generation. He says all of these things will happen with this generation, and and he was correct in that. So there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind when we look at these oracles from Isaiah. The first thing is that they are recorded in Isaiah's book more for the Jewish people, for the tribe of Judah, than for the actual nation that God's wrath is going to come on. So even though some of them are about Assyria and Moab and other countries, okay, the message is primarily for God's people. God is telling Judah what he will do with their enemies. And of course, the good news is, the bottom line is, God's going to defeat them all and get rid of them all. So that's Judah wants to hear that and needs to hear that. It's also going to instill hope in the Jewish people. Hope not only because their enemies are being destroyed, but also a hope in the God who is going to destroy them. Right? At least that's the purpose of Isaiah. They need to see the wrath of God as the vindication of his justice and his righteousness against injustice and unrighteousness. See, God does not stand for sin in any people. So in that sense, the message to the Jewish people is, look at, if you are sinning, if you're sinful before God, then you better be warned that his wrath will come upon you as well. Of course, you only need to be afraid of God if you're unjust and unrighteous. And that's the same with us. Our fear of God oftentimes keeps us from sin, and our fear of God leads us to trust him and have faith in his rule and his justice and in his righteousness. But he's also the sovereign God who reigns and rules over all the nations. They neither conquer nor are conquered unless God allows it within his plan. And we all know that, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is the oracles were written for Judah's sake. Secondly, you need to keep in mind that these oracles appear in this section from chapter 6 to 39 about the Son. Okay, they're about the Son. And the virgin sign is not only a sign who points the way to forgiveness and righteousness, but it's also a signal. We've already seen this in the chapters we looked at. His coming signals that the next stage of God's grace has come. It's the changing point. Right? And so this is why it's very important that as we're going through these sections, that we need to expect to see more about the Messiah, more about Jesus in these texts than what we may have thought that there should be. And that's exactly what we're going to do. In fact, when I told you to read the chapters for Sunday, I told you to look for 5 places where you might see Jesus. And we're going to point those out. All right, so we need to keep an eye out for pictures that reveal Jesus to us, and that's what we're going to see. All right, let's begin here with chapter 13. I'm going to go fairly quickly with some of this, but if I end up going too quick for you, just flag me down and I'll slow up a bit. All right, chapter 13, verse 1 begins, "This is the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah saw." So now it starts out actually describing Babylon as God's instrument of wrath against Judah, against Jerusalem. Then it switches halfway through to a vision of God's wrath on Babylon. So the oracle about Babylon and God's wrath is that God's going to use Babylon as his instrument of wrath on Jerusalem. But then God's going to bring his own wrath on Babylon later. We'll bring that in. So looking in verse 2, Isaiah sees here a banner of war being raised on a hill, which is giving the signal to attack the city. So I don't know if you've seen any of the old movies, particularly around this period of time when an army gets ready, they communicated with flags. And so the guy would be up there on the top of the hill, the high point where the armies could see, and they wait for the signal. And when he would wave it back and forth, they knew that was the signal to attack. And that's what's being pictured here. So this army is getting a signal from God to attack the city. In verse 3, God says that he commanded it. He did it. And he commanded them to execute his anger. So you see there's the wrath of God. So this army that is attacking the city, God calls them my consecrated ones. Now sometimes when we read that, we think, oh, this can't be Babylon because the consecrated one is a holy one. A consecrated one is a saint. This must be the Jewish people. Well, no, that's not what it's talking about. And when we think that, it's because we misunderstand what the word consecrate means. So this term, a consecrated one, it always means the same thing. And what it means is that you are set apart for God's purpose. Okay, set apart for God's purpose. But it does not always mean the same people. Right? So God can set apart his people, or he can set apart his enemies to bring about his purposes. Okay, and this is what he's saying here. He has set apart the armies of Babylon to execute his wrath, and we see them here attacking the gates of the city of Jerusalem. God chose them, he consecrated them, he set them apart to be his instruments of wrath against Judah. So why are they coming? Look at verse 4. Why are they coming? The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. So a host is just a large army. A large army for battle. They came from a distant land and from the ends of the heaven. The Lord and the weapons of his indignation to do what? What's it say there? To destroy the whole land. See, God is angry with the idolatry of Judah, and he is going to destroy them, the whole land. Now, if you remember back in chapter 1, verse 7 that we looked at last week, it says there that the land of Judah will be burned up, which is exactly what happens when you read the stories, the narrative in Kings and 2 Kings and Chronicles. You read that when the Babylonians came in, they burnt the city. They burned it to the ground, and including the temple. It is burned up. It was made desolate by a foreign army. Isaiah tells them that they need to wail. You see that in verse 6? They need to wail in the day of the Lord. In chapter 1:12 again, it says that the Lord of hosts has a day in which the pride of men will be brought low. Okay, so the wrath of God being poured out is the day of the Lord, a day of wrath where he destroys people and their countries, their cities, their homeland, everything about them. So specifically then, what is the day of the Lord here that Isaiah is referring to? Well, it's the wrath of God on a nation, obviously. That's what it says in verse 6. It is the destruction that comes from the Almighty. The Lord's day, then, is the day when God destroys Judah and Jerusalem. Remember, I've told you that you need to memorize certain dates. Okay, he destroys the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 by Assyria. He destroys Jerusalem and Judah by the Babylonians in 586. So this is the day of the Lord that he's talking about. And we got to remember that sometimes the context points us to a specific event. And so we can't always take it generally. I know that some people, when they read, as soon as they read the phrase the day of the Lord, they automatically jump to the second coming. That's what it's about. Well, that's not what Isaiah is talking about here at all. He's talking about coming by the Babylonians in 586 to destroy the whole land of Judah. Okay, verse 9. In verse 9, we're told that when the day of the Lord comes, and he defines it again, the cruel wrath and fierce anger of God. Okay, it's his wrath that's being poured out. When it comes, it will make the land a desolation, and it will destroy its sinners. That's a hard thing for people these days, because they don't want to know that God's against sinners. God loves sinners. Well, actually, if you read the book of Psalms, you'll discover that God hates sinners. And he judges and destroys sinners. And he's very just in doing that. We just make it comfortable so that people don't understand how much they need to fear the wrath of God. One of the reasons why people don't understand the grace of God today is because they don't see that his wrath is cruel and that it's fierce anger against both sin and sinners. So God is both just and righteous to pour out his cruel wrath on sinners. All right, if God is going to destroy the sinners, and he will make the land a desolation. Again, I've told you this word desolation is important. It'll show up more again as we get particularly in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Okay, but this word appears 115 times in the prophets. And it only shows up 19 times in the New Testament. Right? So making the land desolate. And both Amos and Hosea that we've already looked at, they've used this word to talk about God's wrath on the northern tribe of Israel. So if you recall, back in chapter 6, verse 11, Isaiah asked God, how long is he going to punish Judah? And God's answer was, until the cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste. Okay, when I first presented that last week, I realized afterwards that I misled you. It made it sound like how long was Isaiah supposed to prophesy? And he can't prophesy until 586, because that would have made him close to 200 years old. So it wouldn't have worked very well. But what it was, he was asking God how long he was going to pour out his wrath on his people. And he's saying until it is a desolate waste. So in verses 10 and 13, Isaiah, now he uses apocalyptic language. So this is the first time in the prophets that we see this kind of language. So if you look at those verses there, he describes, he just talks about the stars and the constellations, talks about the moon and the sun, that they all stop shining. Now we know, of course, that if the sun were to stop shining, what would happen to us? We would freeze to death, okay? And it even says there, if you notice that the earth will be shaken out of its place. Okay, it's talking about its orbit. The earth is going to be shaken out of its orbit. Well, if you change the orbit of the earth just by a degree, it will destroy life as we know it. So this is not literal language. It's figurative language here. It's exaggerated language. That's what apocalyptic language means. It's exaggerated language to give us a picture of how bad it's going to be. And in every instant where a prophet uses this kind of apocalyptic language, where the stars fall from heaven, where the sun stops shining, where the earth shakes, and all of these things, all of this, that sounds like natural disasters, but they're exaggerated things. This, what they're saying is that there is a kingdom change coming, a regime change that is coming. So God's ending a nation, and the new nation of God is going to be reigning in its place. So keep that in mind as we go forward from here as well. So this is the first place that we see this. So it gives us this exaggerated picture of how bad the day of the Lord is going to be. In verses 14 to 16, these verses describe some of the horrible acts that the Babylonians are going to do when they come and attack Jerusalem and the cities of Judah. We won't look at them in any detail, but beginning at verse 17 now, the vision changes. Okay, Isaiah describes now what will eventually happen to Babylon. So another kingdom is going to rise to power, and it's going to wipe out Babylon like Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, remember in chapter 2, he said, or chapter 1, verse 9, he said, if it wasn't for the fact that God preserved a remnant, we would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, he's talking about this time when Babylon destroys them. But now the same description is being made of Babylon. So in verse 17, he says, behold, I'm stirring up the Medes against them. Now at the time that Isaiah writes this, the Medes are still a fairly insignificant group of people. And what gives the Medes their power eventually is when they join forces with the Persians. And Daniel in Daniel chapter 5 describes the armies of the Medes coming into the throne room of the king of Babylon, King Belshazzar, and his time comes to an end. Well, if you like history again, so God is raising up the Medes to deliver God's wrath against Babylon. That happened in 539 BC. So if you have that chart I gave you, you'll see it there, 539 BC. That's a year before the Babylonian captivity came to an end in 538, when the king of Persia, Cyrus, let the Jewish people return to the land. And Isaiah, this is 1900 years before it ever happened that Isaiah is saying this. Isn't that amazing? See? That God showed all of this to him. All right, chapter 14 changes gears. We're still in this oracle against Babylon, and chapter 14, but it changes gears. In verses 3 to 23 of chapter 14, it describes now, it doesn't look at the nation, but it's looking at the king of Babylon in particular. And it's describing the end of King Belshazzar of Babylon. Okay, he was a cruel king, and he and his forefathers destroyed a lot of lives. They killed a lot of people during their reigns. The exiles of Babylon are rejoicing over the death and defeat of the king of Babylon. Okay, so when the Medes came in and they captured him and killed him, then everybody let up a cheer. Okay, so verse 3 says that the exiles, that's the Jewish people, are now in Babylon. They're going to take up a taunt. Taunt really isn't a good word, because in our English it implies a sarcastic response. And I don't think it's being sarcasm. A better word would be the word proverb. They take up this proverb about how the king of Babylon is now dead and his king is fallen. Now I want us to look at just a few of the words here. It all describes him, but I want you to look at verse 12. How are you fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn? How are you cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low? You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world look like a desert and overthrew its cities, who did not let his prisoners go home? You see, they're talking here about King Belshazzar. A lot of people think that this is about who? Satan, yeah. And it's really wrong. It comes from a really bad translation in the King James, where instead of translating the Hebrew, they actually translate the Latin word from the Latin Vulgate, and they say, "Oh, Lucifer." Okay? And so everybody says, "Oh, okay, this is talking about Satan." Well, it's not talking about Satan. Then you say, well, wait a minute, Satan was in heaven and made himself like the Most High. Well, the only reason why we think Satan did that is because of this verse. Okay? And these verses are not talking about them. They're talking about, remember last week we talked about the mountains and how the mountain was the place where the God of the nation dwelled because it was the highest place. They built their tabernacles and their temples on the highest places in their nations to honor their God. And what the king of Babylon was doing is he was placing himself in those high places. And he was pretty much saying to the world, I'm the God, I'm all powerful. The world has got to bow down to me. I'm the most high God in this world. Remember in Daniel chapter 3, when they made them bow down to the statue that he built. I think it was a statue of himself. There's debate about that, but I think it fits to his arrogance here, that I'm the most high God. And he says, there's no God that can defeat me. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, oh yeah, our God is stronger than your God, and he can defeat you. He says, no way. And then, of course, they threw them in the fiery furnace, and God showed himself to be more powerful. So what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He says, okay, all right, I am not the most powerful God, but I've got the most powerful God now on my team. So there's me and my gods, and there's the Jewish God. We're all together, so that makes us the most powerful nation in the world. Do you understand that? So that's the relationship of the mountain. The imagery of the mountain is very important. It's talking about the power of being a God-like person, being on the most high places. And it says, look, you brought him down to Sheol, to the place of the dead, and there he lies. People are going to stare at his dead body and say, this is the guy that destroyed us? He's nobody anymore. You see, that's what it's talking about. All right, I just wanted to straighten that out for you this morning. All right, so back to chapter 14. When God changes the regime in charge from Babylon to the Medes and the Persians, he also fulfills part of the promise that he mentioned about the Jews, that there would be a remnant who would return home. So if you look at chapter 14, verse 1, for the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land. Right? So that Babylon has come in, destroyed Judah and the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. It's a desolation. It's a wasteland. They've taken the survivors back to Babylon as exiles. They've been in exile for 70 years. And now that Babylon is destroyed, the new army, the Medes and the Persians, are going to let them return as the remnant. So this is the Jewish remnant returning homeland. And then it says, and sojourners will join them. Okay, so somebody else is going to be joining these Jewish remnant who are returning home. And they will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. So this is a picture of Gentile refugees now also coming back with the Jewish people and coming to the house of God. Of course, the house of Israel is the house of their God. That's the meaning of the terminology. The house is where the God of the nation dwells on the mountain. And Isaiah pictured this in chapter 2 again, as we looked at last week. So we know that the Gentiles come to God, to the God of Jacob, after the gospel is proclaimed from Jerusalem. That's what we know when we looked at chapter 2. So he's saying here the Gentiles are going to come to the God of Jacob. It doesn't tell us when that will happen, just that the remnant is going to return, and some of the Gentiles are going to return, but they're going to return to God. But then we have verse 2. Look at it. And the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppressed them. This seems to be saying that foreigners, Gentiles, will return with them, and that when they return with them, the Jewish people are going to make them their slaves. And they will capture their nations and conquer the Gentile nations. That's what it seems to be saying here. So the first sentence of verse 2 can actually be explained by understanding the term of the house of Israel. That it's not talking about Israel per se, but it's talking about the house of God, okay, where God dwells. The Gentiles are not coming to Israel, but they're coming to Yahweh, the God of Israel. They're coming to his house so he can be their God and they can be his slaves. Of course, that fits to the New Testament teaching. In Romans 6, we've been set free from sin's slavery to become slaves of righteousness. Okay, we have that domain, that spiritual domain where sin rules over our lives. But Christ delivers us from that domain and transfers us to the domain of love and grace, where we are slaves to righteousness. So that can explain the first part of this verse. But the second sentence seems to be saying again that the Jews will raise up an army, capture the Gentiles, who will rule over them. So when do the Jews rule over the world? That obviously hasn't happened yet. I mean, is this still something that's future, or is this something else? Is there something else that is at play here? Okay. First thing I want to tell you is it's too early in Isaiah to know exactly what he's talking about. In fact, if we take the context, we can actually make it understand that he's saying something totally different than Israel becoming a powerful nation in the world. Okay, because I mean he is saying that they are now free from Babylon. Okay, the Medes have come in and destroyed the Babylonians, and they're going to return to their land. They're going to rebuild. The Gentiles are going to come and be part of them. And then the last line, they will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppressed them. So in the context here, their captors are who? Who was the one that captured the Judah?
Babylon.
Babylon did. That's their captors, okay? So the reason that they are free now is because the Medes in chapter 3:17 conquered Babylon. Is the they, then, in this sentence, is it the Medes, or is it Babylon, or is it the Jews? Well, if you put them all in there, you'll discover there's only one answer, and it's the Medes. And it would read like this: the Medes will take captive those Babylonians who were the Jews' captors, and the Medes will rule over those Babylonians who oppressed the Jews. Did you see how that can be its meaning? Okay? Now, I'm going to caution myself in saying that that's the final interpretation at this point. It could be that Isaiah is introducing something else, but the context certainly fits to that interpretation. We're going to have to wait till we get further into Isaiah to see if he's talking about something else. Are you okay with that? All right. Okay, so let's move on then to the oracle concerning Assyria in chapter 14, verse 24. So God is asserting that what he planned for Assyria is going to take place. Look at verse 25. I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains will trample him underfoot. Okay, so don't worry about the Assyrians. I am going to take care of them. I'm going to destroy them. God is declaring that he's the top God. Again, it's using that language of the mountain. I'm the top God. Okay, in chapter 2, his mountain was a small mountain, and then it grows and becomes larger than all the other mountains. God is the highest God in the world. And he is more powerful than the gods of the Assyrians. So he says there, look at the verse 25, and his yoke, that's the yoke that the Assyrians put on other people, his yoke will depart from them. So the Assyrians are no longer going to be able to put people under their yoke because they don't have a yoke anymore. Why? Because they don't have any power. Why? Because God's destroyed them. And his burden, which is really another way of talking about his government, his power, will no longer be on his shoulder. So the thing that I find interesting in this oracle is that he uses this phrase, the government will be on his shoulder. Does it remind you of anything? Mm-hmm. Yeah, back in chapter 9, verse 6, talking about Jesus. For unto us a child will be born, a son will be given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. So Isaiah is using these same words to not specifically say this is about Jesus, but that the whole reason that his power, the Assyrians' power and government is overthrown is because it is the child that is born to us, the Christ child, the Messiah, who has the government of God, the top God. He's the reason for their demise. And the whole thing is to focus back and say, okay, the Christ child is the one that we need to look to as our hope. So that's what this oracle kind of does. All right, look to verse 28. In verse 28, we have the oracle concerning Philistia. So it tells us there that in the year that King Ahaz died, he was given this oracle. Now, King Ahaz died in 715 BC. King Ahaz was probably the last of the good to bad kings of the dynasty of David. And his grandfather put the Philistines under a lot of pressure, had them under his thumb. And basically the whole dynasty of the kings of David up to this time were a pain in the neck to the Philistines, to the Philistines. Okay, and this is what he's pointing out. I mean, do you remember Goliath? He was a Philistine. Okay, so they were constantly being set back and put down by the Davidic kings of Judah. But just before Ahaz died, the Philistines came in and attacked the southern regions of Judah and were able to overtake that and occupy that territory. And so they thought, wow, we gained some victory here. And then when Ahaz died, they got really cocky and they said, hey, with Ahaz out of the way, we can keep going and maybe even conquer Judah altogether. And so we have this oracle of God's wrath against them. And what Isaiah is telling us is that Philistia, he's telling them, don't rejoice over that victory that you just had, because just because Isaiah is dead, okay, you think that you're no longer under the threat of the Davidic kings, but you are. And he says that just because Ahaz is gone, they think they have a chance, but the rod, you see that, the rod or the offspring of David. So look at verse 29. The rod or the offspring of David is going to turn into what? A serpent. So that is how God's wrath is going to appear to the Philistines. So in the vision, Isaiah probably saw a rod that was thrown down and turned into a snake. Okay? And he identifies that rod as the offspring of David, as the Messiah. So he's using imagery here again that the people of Judah would be familiar with, because what immediately came to your mind? Moses. When he stood before Pharaoh, he threw his rod down and it became a snake. Now the Pharaoh magicians, they did the same thing, but then what did the snake of the rod of Moses do? It ate them all up, okay? So hey, you think you're powerful? I'm the most powerful God, okay? This is what he's saying here. And he's telling me, he says, look, don't worry about it. God's rod will come against Philistia. You don't have to worry about them at all. Just like the Moses' rod becoming a snake. So, and look at verse 32. He says, Yahweh has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. All right, so the people of Judah are going to find refuge in the snake from the rod that is in the image of the snake of the rod of Moses. What other incident in Moses' life did the people of Israel find refuge by going to the snake? Yeah, when they were bitten by the snakes, and in order to be saved from the sure death of the snake bite, Moses took a snake and put a bronze snake and hung it on a rod and said, if you look at that, then God will heal you. And of course, when you turn to John chapter 3, what does Jesus tell Nicodemus about that snake that Moses hung on the rod that raised up on the pole? Not John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15.
He will be raised up.
He will be raised up. It says, that was a picture of me. We would not think of Jesus being, of a snake being a metaphor, a type of Jesus, but he is. And that's what's being pictured here in the oracle against Philistia. And again, pointing out that it is the snake, the offspring, the Christ of David, who will bring about their victory. All right, moving along. Chapters 15 and 16, we have the oracle concerning Moab. Right? So in chapter 15, we see Moab. They're being attacked by their enemies, which we already know are the Assyrians. So it's all about the same time. So it's either going to be the Assyrians or it's Babylon, but most of these countries is going back to the time of Assyria, because they're up here. When they come down, there's Aram, and then there is Israel, the northern tribes, and just off to this side is Moab, and just off to this side is Philistia. And so Assyria is going to conquer all of that. In the middle here at the bottom is Judah. He tries to take them, but they are unsuccessful. Remember, I said they only came, they were like a river that only came up to the neck. Okay, so this is what he is describing in chapter 15. Moab being attacked by the Assyrian enemy forces. And what happens is the people of Moab are being displaced as refugees. Okay, and so we know all about refugees because it's in our world today. Refugees from all kinds of different countries that are fleeing their countries, and you see them with just bags of things and carts and men and women and their children just going along, not knowing where they're going to go. And so God sees these refugees, and his heart goes out to them. You see that in verse 5. Okay, my heart cries out for Moab. He let her fugitives flee to Zoar. So God is feeling some emotion here for the refugees of Moab. And in chapter 16, verse 1, these refugees are appealing now to Judah to take them in and to help them. So in verses 3 and 4, they come to Judah and they say, please give us advice, give us some justice in this world. Okay, they protect us, give us refuge, security, shelter. They're asking for all of these things from Judah. Well, Judah's going to respond. Now, before I can tell you what Judah's response is, we have to correct a grammatical error in our ESV Bibles. So if you notice there, the ESV starts the quote of the leaders of Moab in verse 3. Do you see the quotation mark there? Beginning of verse 3? Okay, so that's the leaders of Moab speaking. Where do you find the end quotation mark? At the end of verse 5. Okay? Well, that makes the leaders of Moab saying the things that are in verses 4 and 5, which doesn't make any sense at all, because that's the answer that God is giving them. So I believe the end quotation mark should be halfway through verse 4 after the word destroyer. Okay? So that's where the Moab leaders end. They're talking then, beginning with the when the oppressor is no more. That's God speaking in answer to their request for Judah to take them in. Okay, so let's take a look at those. Verse 4b. When God, so God's giving them their answer. When the oppressor is no more, so that would be Assyria, and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, then a throne will be established in steadfast love. On it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. That's kind of an unexpected answer. He's saying to Moab, he says, you're coming to me to find security and refuge and help and protection. And I'm telling you, when your enemy is gone and left you alone, then a kingdom, a throne is going to be established by the Christ. He's the one you're going to find your help in. He's the one you got to turn to. And his kingdom, his throne will be established in steadfast love and faithfulness. And he will judge in justice and righteousness. Now, one of the things, I haven't brought this out before, is that in the Hebrew language, particularly in the prophets, they have these word pairs. Word pairs. Pairs of words that go together. So we have them in our English language too. That they just, the two words go together. You can't describe. I had one in my mind and now I've lost it, so I'm not even going to try to think about it again. But these one of the word pairs is the word steadfast love and faithfulness. Okay? You'll often read that God had steadfast love and faithfulness, right? And they go together. And then you have the words justice and righteousness, always referring to the way God rules. God expects the nations of the world to rule with justice and righteousness, but they don't. And but he will bring a kingdom that will bring justice, which is why he pours out his wrath on the nations, because that's his justice in play. And in righteousness, he's now going to teach them how to live righteously. And he will be steadfast in his love and his faithfulness. So this is the one that Isaiah says that they are going to go to. What I think is going on here is that Moab is asking Zion for help, but word comes back to Moab that there's only hope for them. The only hope for them is that if they can find refuge and find security in the king that's going to come. Because, I mean, Judah really can't offer them any help, because what's going to happen to Judah in just a few years? They're going to be destroyed. There's no security in going to the land of Judah. There's no security in Jerusalem. There's no security in the temple. The security is in the Christ child who's going to be born. All right, so the good news of the Messiah as the coming one is sent to Moab. Isn't this amazing? Do you see that? This is the gospel being taught to Moab. Did they believe? Look at verse 6. They were too proud and arrogant to believe. They didn't believe. And God sent a message to Moab that there is hope if they trust in God in his coming king, and Moab rejected it. So look at what God says in verses 6 to 14. We'll go down towards 14. He says, in 3 years' time, you will be wiped out. Okay? God offers his grace, and people actually refuse it. So this is the message of the gospel being proclaimed to Moab. Right? This is 700 years before Christ came, and they're getting the message of Jesus. Okay, and Jesus talked about it. Sometimes we forget, and I pointed this verse out to you before, Luke 24, verse 46. Jesus sitting there with his disciples, and This is not the road of Emmaus disciples. This is his 12 later on. And he says that it is written in the prophets, the Psalms, and the law that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead. But he didn't end there. We know that. We see the cross and we see the suffering of Christ and we see the resurrection in the Old Testament. But look at what he says. He continues, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to the nations. See that? That's exactly what is happening here in Isaiah chapter 16, in this oracle to Moab. The gospel of repentance and forgiveness of sins is being proclaimed. All right, all the nations need to do is to be called, all the nations need to be called to repentance. All right, there's two oracles left. Chapter 17, we have the oracle concerning Damascus. If you remember back in chapter 7, the nation of Israel and Aram were plotting together to take over Judah. And King Ahaz again was afraid of what was going to happen. Now, they wanted Judah to join forces with them to fight the Assyrians, and Judah refused. So they said, okay, if you refuse, we'll just come and we'll conquer you, and then you will have to fight with us. But Ahaz goes to Assyria and makes an agreement with them that Assyria wouldn't do anything to Judah. And Assyria, of course, they reneged on their deal and they attacked Judah anyways. So chapter 17 is just before this time when Assyria attacks Aram and Israel. Okay, I think in the ESV, instead of Aram, they say Syria. They shouldn't use Syria because that is the modern area of the country of Syria today. And that's probably why they're doing it. But they shouldn't do that because that Syria didn't exist then. It was Aram is the country. So if you remember, so it's just before the Assyria comes down and attacks them. Isaiah says that Assyria will come, and verse 1, Damascus will cease to be a city, and the fortress or the stronghold of Israel will disappear. The kingdom of Aram will disappear. The kingdom of Israel will disappear. All right, and he's already said this on many occasions. But notice what he says in verse 3. He talks about the remnant of Syria, the remnant of Aram. The remnant of Aram. Okay, he's talked about the remnant of Israel. He's talked about the remnant of Judah. But now he's talking about the remnant of Syria. He's also talked about the refugees of Moab. Okay, and what does he say? The remnant of Syria, of Aram, they will be like the glory of the children of Israel. Now this phrase, the glory of Israel, is a phrase that refers to the presence of God in their midst. So the glory of God came and dwelt in the Holy of Holies. That is the glory of God in Israel, God's presence with them. That God is their God, basically is what it means. The glory of Israel is that Yahweh is their God. And what this is saying here is that to the remnant of Syria, of Aram, their remnant will be like the glory of the children of Israel. They will take the God of Israel as their God. That's what it means. Wow. When's that going to happen? Well, verse 4 says, in that day. What day is this? Well, verse 4, that's the day that Assyria comes and attacks them. And it describes Assyria there in those verses like a reaper who comes and strips the land of its fruit and makes it barren and empty. So in this way, it's not a good harvest, it's a bad harvest. They're coming and they're attacking and taking all the people. and the land is left barren and empty. But look at verse 6 though. It says, but gleanings will be left. Right? So in the fruit trees and the olive trees, for instance, what they did was they shook them, and all of the olives would fall out. And so that's what it was when the army came. It was like somebody shaking the tree, and they captured everybody. But on the very top of the tree, there's still some olives left. Okay? That's the gleanings. And so there will be a remnant of people. And he's saying there in both Damascus and Israel. He's already mentioned this before about Israel, but now about Damascus. But what's going to happen to them? Well, look down at verse 7. What's going to happen to you? Okay, these remnant of Gentile people are going to come to God, and He will be their God. And verse 7, in that day, man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. All right, do you remember who I said Isaiah says the Holy One of Israel is? Jesus. It's the Messiah. This is the Christ. Okay, so in that day, they will look on the Holy One of Israel. They'll look on the Christ. And verse 8, he will not look to his altars or the work of his hands, etc. He's not going to have any idols. He's going to give up the idols and follow God. The judgment will come, a remnant will be preserved, and the remnant will abandon their idols and turn to the Messiah. And it will be both Jew and Gentile. So the question is, when does that happen? The only time that happens in the Bible is described for us beginning in Acts chapter 8, when Philip takes the gospel to Samaria. And then in Acts chapter 10, when Peter takes the gospel to Caesarea, to the Gentiles. And then the gospel from there spreads up to Galilee and to Damascus. And Jews and Gentiles come to the Messiah in faith. It's the only time that this is talking about. This is a prophetic picture of the spread of the gospel to the nations. In verses 9 to 14, Isaiah goes back to Assyria now, and to Assyria coming against the cities of Israel, the northern tribes this time. Okay? And he says in verses 10 and 11 that they have forgotten God. They've become comfortable in their idolatry. They act like they have a bright future, but there's coming a day of sorrow for them. In verses 12 and 13, he says that the nations, plural, okay, the nations, plural, are going to come. That would be the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and probably the Romans, because Isaiah's already hinted. He's already said the Assyrians are coming, the Babylonians are coming, and then there's another nation coming to destroy Jerusalem for a second time. So Isaiah describes that, and he describes that as a violent storm at sea. So look at verse 12. In verse 12 it says, "Ah, the thunder of many peoples. They thunder like the thundering of the sea. Ah, the roar of nations. They roar like the roaring of mighty waters. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. Chased like chaff on the mountain." Remember again, that mountain is important. "Before the wind, and whirling dust before the storm." It's not a literal mountain. It's talking about God being the top God. Right? He's the most powerful God, the most high God of all the nations. Okay? And he rules over them. So here we have this picture of these nations at various times coming, described as a storm at sea. And it's a violent storm and a thunderstorm, and the waves thunder against the nation that they're coming against. But he will rebuke them. It says God rebukes them, and they go away. Does that remind you of anything in the New Testament? What does it remind you of?
Jesus calms the storm.
Yeah, Jesus calming the storm. And I'm not saying that this is a prediction of that, But what I'm saying is that this becomes a description of Jesus. Because if you read the narratives in Matthew 8, Mark 4, Luke 8, the disciples are in the boat, Jesus is sleeping in the bottom. They're there, the storm rises up, and they're afraid. They're afraid of the storm because these disciples know the storms on the Sea of Galilee. They're familiar with them. They've dealt with them before. And they know that don't take it lightly. They have to be afraid of these storms. But when Jesus comes up and he calms the storm, what would you think is the natural response of the disciples? Would you think relief? Oh, the storm's over. Wow, man, God, you're Jesus, you're an amazing person. You have power over nature. But guess what it says? And I'll challenge you to read it later. In all three of them, it says the disciples were more afraid because Jesus did that. What would make them more afraid of Jesus than the storm? It's because of what Isaiah says here. Talking about these nations coming like the storm. And God rebukes it and calms the storm of these nations. God controls the nations. Because what they saw in Jesus is, yeah, he just calmed the nature in front of us. But he is that God, that powerful God that controls the nations of the world. That's what they saw, and that's what made them fearful of him. We should take note here that God controls everything. God is the one who brings these nations as judgment. And when he wants, he speaks the word and they stop. When we think about what's happening in our world today and the movement of nations around our world, it's all under God's sovereign control. They can't make a move unless God lets them make a move. Okay? And when God's sovereign judgment, he will stop it when he's ready. He'll start up another one when he's ready. He will stop that when he is ready, and thus it will be until it comes to the end of the age. God is always in control. Do you understand that? That's what's being pictured here. And it's Jesus is that God. He is that powerful God. Okay, we've got to come to the last one here. Chapter 18, the oracle concerning Cush. Cush is the countries in North Africa. So from Palestine you have, I do this backwards for you all the time. Palestine you have Egypt, and then which is sort of halfway between Africa and the Middle East, and then you have these countries in Africa. That's called Cush. Okay, and so what Isaiah is giving us here in chapter 18 is that these countries in North Africa, they're seeing this movement of Assyria, and they're trying to be preemptive against their coming as far as they are. And so they send out envoys to these different nations, including Judah, to form alliances against the Assyrians. Right? Everything that was done back then was done through alliances, right? And they should learn you can't trust anybody, but they do it anyways. So why does Isaiah give us all of these details about the attacks of Assyria on all these nations? He's given us so much detail. It's going to happen within 10 years. Why does he give all those details? What do you think? Because, because the very fact that it's happening soon means that everything Isaiah said will be verified when it happens. The people he's talking to will actually see it, and they will see everything fulfilled exactly the way Isaiah said. What's that going to do to those people, or should do for those people? Should give them hope. It also should make them fear, shouldn't it? Because then when they listen to what Isaiah says about things that are going to happen 700 years from now, then they need to know that that's going to happen, and they need to prepare for it. And that means putting faith in the Christ child, in the who is coming. And they need to take the warnings what's the word I'm thinking of? Seriously, that's the word I want to use. Okay, so from verse 3 here of chapter 18 then, we have Isaiah's response to these envoys that were looking for help. He tells them again that the gospel is their only hope. Look at the middle of verse 3. It says, when, again, here we have another time marker. All right? He says, look at, your only hope here is when a signal is raised on the mountains. And you need to look to that signal. When the trumpet is blown and you need to listen to it. Wow, that's kind of cryptic, isn't it? This is the hope that is being told these nations. They are to look to the signal who is Messiah. Isaiah has already introduced this to us in the prelude in chapter 5, verse 26, and he clarifies it in chapter 11, verse 10 and 12. Chapter 11, 10 and 12, he talks about the branch of Jesse. Okay, the branch of Jesse comes, and God will set him up as a signal for the nations and for the people. Verse 12 says, he will raise a signal for the nations. So the signal is Jesus. So in every case, when Isaiah talks about this raising of a signal, he is referring to the Messiah. Messiah is going to be raised up. He will be the signal. And he's already intimated in the rod and snake incident that when he is raised up as a snake on a pole, that will be the signal. Do you see what Isaiah is starting to picture here? Isaiah has no clue what he's talking about. But he's talking about Jesus being raised on the cross. Look at verse 3 again. Okay. He didn't understand. All you inhabitants of the world, you who dwell in the earth, when a signal is raised on the mountains, look to it. That's your hope. That's your help. Messiah Jesus is the only way to God for all people. See, Jesus wasn't the only one who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. Isaiah said it too. He's the only way. In verses 4 to 6, Isaiah pictures God in his dwelling again on the mountain. And he says he's on this mountain as the God is like the sun and the dew that make the things really good for the harvest, and the harvest begins to grow. And that's the remnant here. The remnant is growing. And he prunes the whole orchard by cutting away the bad branches, and he does that by bringing in foreign armies that defeat them. And all that's left is this really good remnant. And then he says in verse 7, look at that time that God gathers the harvest, when God gathers the remnant from the nations to himself, that's the time that the gospel goes forth from Jerusalem to the nations. You know what it says? At that time, tribute will be brought to the Lord of hosts, to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord of hosts. So the time is when the signal is raised. That's the time that God will draw the remnant to himself. So if it's talking about Jesus dying on the cross, it is talking about beginning particularly at Pentecost, when the remnant of Jews, the small minority, come to faith in Christ. And then the next day, that's 3,000 of them. And then you have another 5,000. And within a few years, you got 21,000 Jews through the book of Acts that have come to Christ. That's the remnant. That's what is being talked about here. When the remnant, when the signal is raised, that is fulfilled when Jesus was raised on the cross. So people from the nations will become. Because what did they do? What did Jesus say? You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem in Judea, Samaria, to the outermost parts of the world. You're going to go out from here. It's no longer coming to Jerusalem. It's taking God to the people, and God now dwells in their hearts. The temple of God is being built by people. And this is what he's talking about. And this is verified here. You say, well, wait a minute, Cliff. It says that they come to Mount Zion. Isn't that Jerusalem? Well, Zion is Jerusalem. But it also refers to earthly Jerusalem, but it also refers to heavenly Jerusalem. But Mount Zion always refers to the dwelling place of God. So they're not coming to Jerusalem, they're coming to God. And to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts. So people from nations are going to come to the God of Jacob on the mountain where he dwells. And again, this is all metaphoric language. It's the same language in Isaiah chapter 2. We know that because it doesn't say they come to Zion, but they come to Mount Zion, to the mountain of God, where God rules. It's about God's sovereign rule. It's about God's saving people. The mountain is, that's what it's all about here. The nations are going to bring their tribute, their offerings of themselves to God.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What are people tall and smooth referred to?
Which verse is that one in again?
7.
7.
And then 2 as well.
Yeah.
It's just a funny thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's just a funny description of. I think he's trying to say the people from all different types come to God.
Okay.
I think that's what he's trying to say. In John chapter 4, Jesus is out one day, and he ends up in a Samaritan town. And he talks to a woman, remember the woman at the well? And Jesus says or the Samaritan woman said to Jesus, our fathers worshipped on this mountain. Referring to the city of Samaria, which is the capital of the northern tribes. But you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. But the hour is coming, in fact is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. See, Jesus is talking about what Isaiah is talking about here. That it's not the literal mountain of Jerusalem that people go to. But it's God, and he dwells in people by his Spirit. Hebrews 12:18 says the same thing. You have not come to a literal mountain that may be touched, where a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages can be spoken to them. He says you haven't come to that. And that was Mount Sinai that he's describing there, not even Mount Moriah where Jerusalem is. Hebrews 12:22. But you have come to Mount Zion, not Jerusalem, but to Mount Zion, to the dwelling place of God. And he clarifies it, to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gatherings, to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkling of his blood. You see, that defines it all. That's what Isaiah is talking about. All right, let me summarize this, and then we'll draw this to a close. So I'm going to put it up on the screen here. Oh, all right. I thought it was all. They're little, but I'm going to summarize it this way. So this is what we have learned so far in Isaiah. Okay? And we can't conclude anything else but this. The Assyrians are going to expand their boundaries. They will conquer Aram, Israel, Moab, and Philistia. They will attempt to take Judah, but will fail. After a while, the Babylonians will conquer Assyria, and then it will go after Judah, and will conquer them, and will destroy the city of Jerusalem, and take the survivors back to Babylon as exiles. God will raise up the Medes who will overtake Babylon and set the exiles free to return to their homeland. Then the Messiah will come and restore the house of David. He will establish his throne at the highest mountain, and he will be raised as a signal on the mountain, and the nations will come to him. The Messiah will establish a throne for the house of David. The word of the Lord will go out from Jerusalem. Then on the last day, Jerusalem will be destroyed once again. This is the message of Isaiah up to this point. Everything in Isaiah points to Jesus, the Son who has been given, the hope of the nations. Okay, so he is prophesying of a period of events that will happen over a 700-year period, from 740 BC all the way to 70 AD. And that's all we have. So we need to keep going, find out what more Isaiah has to say. Well, I hope that was a good study for you this morning. Sure should strengthen your faith in our God, because we worship Yahweh, the top God, the powerful one. All right, Curtis, you want to just close that tape for us? Thank you. All right, we're going to sing in closing here. We're going to sing Away, not Away, O Little Town of Bethlehem. But before